Thank you, Eli. Thanks for coming. My name is Nacin. I'm one of the lead developers for WordPress. I live here in Washington, D.C., so thank you for enjoying the outskirts of this fine city. I hope you make it into D.C. at some point. Today, I'm going to talk about trust, community, and automatic updates. I sound like Eli for a second here. I think it's pretty obvious that updates are important for a number of reasons, whether we're dealing with security, dealing with this idea that we want to always be running the absolute latest and greatest of software. Of course, we put a lot of time and energy into this, and by we, I mean all of us here, to whatever it is we're working on. Of course, we want people to be running the latest stuff. We have one more that we want to add for us, is that we want to limit the pain of self-hosting. Many of you work on distributed software projects. If you don't have the ability to control the server environment that you're on, this is a bit of a problem. WordPress, we want updates to be seamless. And we also want to deal with this concept of, I mean, you've heard, of course, indie web. But my thought is that if like running your own WordPress site or running your own anything that you want to just install gets even just 1% harder, the user is probably going to be gone. And in our case, that's an awful lot of users. So back in the day, when we thought about like updates for WordPress, this was actually the pain that people needed to deal with. And you think, oh God, I haven't used that in forever, and I don't touch a server if it doesn't have SSH enabled. But even now, a lot of people who are using distributed pieces of software, whether it's WordPress or Drupal or anything else, this is still how they're uploading the files. Hopefully there's an S in front of it, but this is still what they're doing. And for a long time, this is what it was as well. And in 2008, we added this really cool button. And update automatically. You clicked it, yay, everything worked. And so we have this, one of our philosophies in WordPress is striving for simplicity. This idea that like, let's see how simple we can make something. And so we have an actual document on these philosophies. And here's what it says. It's that we want to improve ease of use and make things similar to understand. And this is what's been happening in the last few releases. Updates used to be this painful manual task. And it was too tricky for a lot of users. This, of course, is referring to FTP. And so we simplified it down to just a single click, this one button of update automatically. But this isn't very automatic, is it? I mean, really, it's like update automatically with an asterisk next to it. Really, so we changed the button to update now, is what it looks like now. And the document continues saying that now anyone can perform one-click upgrades on anything that they wanted to. And this was the only example in this document of striving for simplicity. We still haven't updated it, I think, because I like using it as an example in talks. But I think we could do a lot better than this. And we don't need to settle for this idea of like, oh, let's just reduce it to a button. So we did, in WordPress 3.7, which came out last October, 13 months ago, automatic updates of WordPress in the background. This was very nervous. They're very nerve-wracking. This idea of like, there are so many lessons in trust and responsibility here. When you first heard about this, if it's not today or if it is today, were you nervous or scared? Self-updating PHP application? Yeah, okay. When I normally ask this question, like every hand goes up. So I think you guys are just sleeping after lunch. Because like this idea, I mean, sure, you can, run composer update, that's fine. But like if you're looking at something like this where you have, a PHP application updating its own files, that's scary for about 3,000 different reasons, okay? Assuming that your application has 3,000 files. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. This was the reaction in our community, right? They were like, fuck no. I was like, hell no, not doing this. But we had our reasons. Because with WordPress now powering more than 23% of the top 10 million websites, we owe it to a significant segment of the internet to keep them secure, to keep sites secure. But this actually isn't really true. If you're a news junkie like me, or even not, probably, even if you never use WordPress at all, you're hitting a WordPress site on a daily basis. If you were in my talk yesterday about assumptions of WordPress, I went through some of the bigger sites that are using it. The vast majority of news websites, 9 of the top 10 newspapers in the country use WordPress for a lot of their stuff. Everyone hits WordPress every day. You don't want WordPress to be like the malware place. It's not Android, okay? Like we have certain standards here. We owe it to everyone to keep it secure. So that said, it took us a lot to get here. It took us a lot of knowledge, it took a lot of experience, and of course it took trust in the community to do this. And these 3 points are really important. Now, mind you, we started this process back in 2008, really 2007 when that was getting developed. It wasn't that it was last year and we did it in 3 months, which is true, but it was also 6-7 years worth of knowledge that was built up to this point. So what happened is that the end of July last year, WordPress founder Matt Mullenweg was on stage at our annual conference, WordCamp San Francisco, and announced that we were going to do this. There are plenty of project leaders that enjoy like the flair of announcing something from on stage. At this point, there was no code written. There was this cool experimental plugin that had done it. No one really was sure, like, can we really pull this off? But we wanted to try it. We want to strive for that simplicity. We want to be able to get to that point. So very quickly, a blog post went up that talked about this, like this idea. It outlined, here was the proposal, here were the ideas. And these were initially the major technical hurdles. These were the 10, 15 tickets that need to happen. We need to make sure that we're running checksums over files, or we need to make sure that, we're always communicating with WordPress.org in a certain way. We needed to get through this. And then we opened it up for the community. So for the entire month of August last year, while code was being written, but also just generally while we were still trying to flesh this out, we encouraged as much conversation as possible. And you've heard this before, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. This is usually used derisively, but it also can be used in a very good way of gut checking something. So in our case, we collected all of these fears, all these uncertainties, and people who were doubting things, and we tried to actually figure out what they were trying to say. So we heard things like, my site will break, or my plugins will stop working, or also you'll change something that I liked, or you'll remove something that I liked, or you'll add something that I absolutely can't stand, or some other things that are a little more difficult for us to combat, which is, I don't want to give WordPress too much access to my site, which I reminded them they were using WordPress. Bring on the mothership. Most of these are direct quotes, by the way, from blog posts in the community, from comments to our blog posts, things of that nature. Why do I get the feeling that this sounds like Big Brother? This sounds too risky to me. It's Murphy's Law all over again. This sounds like a security nightmare, which is probably true, except for the fact that you can also think about the alternative, which is every other site out there is insecure. So there's a balance here. Or I don't trust you to do this well enough, or for that matter, in general. I don't trust you to do anything at all. There's then I work in enterprise, I work in government, I want to do this myself. Don't you know I'm a developer, I don't need all of this. Will my high traffic site, all 1,000 hits a day, will it have downtime? Or a few million, it's a fair question. You're going to screw up my version control, which is not good at all, okay? My host already does this for me, which is my favorite complaint ever. Great. That's awesome. Your host already does this, which means that we don't need to worry about it. I would much rather your host do this, because then it's their problem, not mine. But also at the same time, this also means that there were already hundreds of thousands of WordPress sites already being updated automatically by the host on the day that it was released every single time. So it's not that people weren't used to it happening suddenly. It was that they weren't used to it happening suddenly and us letting them know that, by the way, it's us instead of your host. Some other things, of course, that were expressed is please consider an opt-in or an opt-out. And I'll tell you right now that there is no checkbox anywhere, and I'll explain why. There's also this one, that the PHP community is going to think we're insane, which, let's be honest, you already did. But of course, this is interesting. Are we insane? Yeah, probably just a little bit. So we worked really hard to explain absolutely everything and document our decisions and document rationale, and we wanted to explain really why we did it. And Angie was talking about this morning as well in her keynote, of this idea of documenting everything openly as much as possible, trying to lead rather than being the boss. And so we sat there and listened. And we tried not to be defensive in any way. At no point were we ever defensive. We just we tried to explain what our thoughts were. You're not going to make certain people happy. You're not going to make them no longer angry in many cases as well. But we certainly tried for what was reasonable. And we did make adjustments along the way in terms of how we were going to implement this, the different safeguards that we were going to have in there, but we still stuck to our philosophies. And we have a number of them. One is that software should ideally work out of the box. It shouldn't require any configuration. You've seen you've had this idea of a 5-minute install, the famous 5-minute install for WordPress. No one goes through that anymore. First off, 4 minutes, 50 seconds of it is uploading it over FTP. I'm not kidding. That was factored into the time that it took. Nowadays, it's you go to GoDaddy or you go to some host and you say I want a site, and it says here's a WordPress site. Boom, dumps you into the dashboard. It's already installed. They don't even need to do it. Software should work well out of the box. If we're going to do updates like this, it should be there. Another one of our philosophies is knowing when to recognize the vocal minority, where we have this great community, but there are the people who normally speak up sometimes they're not necessarily representative of those who are not, including, for that matter, the contributors. The vast majority of contributors to a project who are contributing code are going to be developers. They need to be able to put their feet in users' shoes. And so for us, we sometimes need to say, like, very simply, yes, this feature isn't for you. Auto updates wasn't designed for me. It wasn't designed for most of you here. But it is designed for your users, and they are the ones who are going to benefit from it. They're the same users who, in our case, many times they have no idea what PHP even is. GoDaddy dumped them onto this dashboard. They forgot it. They didn't even realize it was WordPress. Another philosophy is this idea of designing for the majority of your users for what makes sense. So if we ship a feature that the majority of users just want to immediately turn off, well, now we've kind of failed a little bit. If we ship that same feature and we don't turn it on by default, why are we even shipping the feature to begin with? So this idea of, like, please consider an opt-in or please consider an opt-out, for us, we're like, well, we like to not have UI if we can help it. We like to not have preferences of the UI if we can help it. There are a lot of great writings on this, on decisions, not options, free software UI. A lot of our own philosophies are based on some writings from 2002, 2003, 2004 from a GNOME contributor. His name is Havoc Pennington. Lives down in North Carolina, I believe. Ometer.com, check it out, some really great essays. Not now, because I'm talking, but it's good stuff. And in this case, this idea of, like, decisions, not options, if there are too many user preferences, the user will not be able to find any of them. They won't understand what's important or what's not. And frankly, all you're doing is you're just pushing the burden of your decision that you should be making onto your user with every single checkbox. So we try to limit those as much as possible. In this case, if we had a checkbox that was off by default and you would need to check it in order to get security updates automatically, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because now we're shipping a default that is less secure than you already had. So let's say we shipped it with it on by default, and now a user can easily just shoot themselves in the foot by unchecking it. Not that there's no way to turn it off, of course there is, but it requires something in the configuration file. Because at the very least, if you can get to the configuration file, then maybe you know what you're doing a little more. But if you don't even know what you're doing in the file, at that file system, and all you're doing is using WordPress as a dashboard, as an application, we don't want you to have a checkbox that you could just shoot yourself in the foot with. So I want to walk, since this is a PHP conference, I want to talk a little bit about how it works. And in the WordPress case, it's also, this is our pitch on how, why you should actually trust it. So first, the primary developer on the project, I was the release lead for WordPress 3.7, so this was under my purview, but the main person who wrote the update system for going back 6 or 7 years, because that's the amount of knowledge and experience that we're able to build up, published an in-depth explainer during beta as to precisely how it worked. And he walked through these different steps. First off, WordPress.org says, hey, like, there's a new update. And for this, you know, going back to the sphere of, like, I don't trust you well enough, not at all, but well enough. Well, for us, you know, sometimes releases go bad. We've all had the experience of, like, doing a second release the next day to be able to clean up the mess of the first release, or 5 hours later, or pulling the zip back so people can stop downloading it. This has happened to most of us. So and the way we structured is that the API can roll out updates slowly. So if it's just a maintenance release and not a security release, for example, we can wait 5, 6, 10 hours, let's say, to make sure that there are no major bugs coming back in. And then we're like, okay, we can start releasing it. But we can also do a delay rollout there as well. We don't need to release it to all 10, 20, 60 million sites all at once. We can instead say, let's only update like 1 out of every 100 sites. And go from there. And then we can check some of our data to see what's going well, whether things are passing, things are failing. It's essentially like continuous integration just across only like 30 million servers. This idea of like, it sounds like a security nightmare. Well, we only do this if we can communicate with WordPress.org securely. And you're like, wait, so you do regular updates if you can't communicate securely? Yes. Because it's more important that they get the update to begin with than they can't update at all. Because OpenSSL, believe it or not, is not everywhere. And in many cases, when it is there, it doesn't work. So this is very small. In fact, the numbers that I looked up recently, based on some data that we have, it's only about like 0.12% of all installs do not have OpenSSL, and a smaller version of that do, but it's broken. But that's still, for us, like 300, 400, 500,000 sites. People who won't ever be able to update because they can't communicate securely. So we do have a fallback here. The site then, it determines, can it update to this version? Is it a minor release that I am eligible to update to? Yes, okay, great, I will do that. So then, even in 2014, we're still checking how much disk space we have left, even though we only need a few meg. We had one case of this failure, by the way, worldwide, so that's good. We download, we verify the package, and then we go from there. So in this zip that we download, it might only be the 10 files that were changed because we do partial builds. But we also have one file in there that's just it's like an instructions file, and it gets executed. So that way we can always be able to instruct and install, like, do it this way, don't do it the old way. This was something that was built in originally in 2008. It's brilliant. If you ever end up doing a system that needs to do updates, put something like this in. Because then, for example, we can make if we find out, oh, there's a major bug, we can now start to adjust it in different ways. So we then figure out which files need to be copied, and then we confirm whether we can copy them. So even though we might be downloading 10 files or 50 files or 200 files, we want to limit the I/O as much as possible. Because maybe your solid state drive on your server has really high IOPS, but these shared hosts, nope. They only have, maybe we're talking a few thousand per second in terms of your input-output operations, perhaps, and that's shared across 600 sites. So you got to probably make sure that you're not doing more than you absolutely need to. But we actually do have to do it more than we need to because certain functions in the PHP like to lie sometimes. So for example, if you call the copy function on a file, it will say, yep, I copied it, and then you check the file and it didn't copy at all. Or it only copied it about halfway. So we end up having to check different things, and in fact, after we're done copying, when we're done with all of it, we then we wait a few seconds, and then we go back and we do checksums checks across all of those files that we did move over to make sure that half of it just didn't end up being vanished in the wind. And in that case, of course, we're dealing with a syntax error, the site's down, that's going to be tough to recover from. So if some files did copy and some files didn't, this narrow window of we started copying files and we weren't sure if we finished, we have what we're calling now a critical failure. And for us, data is absolutely everything. In fact, it's what gives us the confidence to know how good this system is, or how bad the system is, of course, as well. So whenever an update check is occurring, the API is sending back very basic, like crash report data. We're dealing with super simple error codes, how much time it took, what file system method, basically some very simple stuff that we now know. I can tell you like what percentage of sites updated using an auto update versus not. Little things like this. But what I can also tell you is that we can now break down our failures into 4 different categories. We have this idea of a transient failure. Okay, the download failed, or the zip archive was in some way wrong, and PCL zip or zip archive can't extract it because the download was screwed up or something. Try again in an hour, not a problem. Simple failure. We realized that files weren't writable, so we're going to try again next version. Hopefully, and we'll email the user letting them know that their site was unable to update and that they should do it themselves. This idea of a complex failure, in that we started the update, we weren't able to complete it, but we were able to roll back because we have that capability as well. They try and update to WordPress 3.9.1, it doesn't work. We download, still in the same process, download the zip of the exact same files, but the 3.9 versions of them, and copy those back over. If that's successful, we have a complex failure, but it's still a recoverable failure at this point. And then we have the E error. This one isn't catchable. And this one, in this case, is that we started copying files and we don't know if we finished. This is the bad one. This is the one we don't want. We want 0 for these. So in this case, we're also only retrying after the user successfully pushes a button, that update now button, the blue one, and confirms as an update. Otherwise, we're like, no, this is way too scary. I'm not trying it again. I already might have broken their site once, not doing it at all. So our early beta testing showed about 90%, 91% success rate. That's still a lot of sites, of course, that are causing all sorts of problems here. We have this critical failure on 10,000, 30,000 sites that are in testing. You can only imagine what it's going to look like in production. So I ended up writing a blog post. It was not as a result of that 90%, but I ended up writing a blog post, perfect for SEO, of the definitive guide to disabling auto updates in WordPress. But this wasn't really that at all. It was actually just an attempt to basically explain why you should trust the system. So in part, it went through all the different safety checks that I just explained, but it went a little bit beyond that as well. Going back to this fear of, we will screw up your version control. Well, no, the very first thing on the list for here's how to disable auto updates was use version control. Because if you're using version control, we assume that you know what you're doing, and we're not going anywhere near it. If we see anything, Subversion, Mercurial, Bazaar, Git, anywhere on the disk, we're like, nope, not going there, you can do it yourself. So we're not going to break anything in this case because, hey, you know what you're doing. You're deploying, you're doing something else. We know this isn't a problem. If you were already previously blocking the update UI, the button from being pressed because you're doing a deployment, whether it's Capistrano or whatever it is you might be doing, that's fine. We're not going to try an auto update either. We think that you know better. We're not going to go near it. This idea of like, you know, my plugins will stop working, or you'll change something, or you'll remove it, or you'll add something. Well, we only turn this on initially for our minor releases, so the patch, the security releases, that's it. So at worst, we're backwards compatible across major versions, so we don't really have major versions. So that's kind of confusing, but basically all we're dealing with in these patch releases are regressions. And all we're dealing with these security releases are, of course, fixing vulnerabilities. So if that regression that previously worked anyway is going to cause something to break, well, I don't know what to tell you. At this point, we do things very targeted, very carefully. We do some other kind of crazy stuff in the sense that when we are doing these patch releases, we don't write code in a very dry way. And you'll laugh like, of course, it's WordPress. But in this particular case, where we have 10 files that are being updated, if only 5 of them update, those other 5 have no dependencies whatsoever across files. We're never adding dependencies across files in a minor release. That way, if 5 updated, 5 didn't, that's fine, the site's still up, they just didn't get 5 fixes. It's a pretty interesting way to approach it, but that's because we really have no idea what's going to go on. We're not going to add a function to file number 1, use it in file number 2. We're going to write it a little different way and then clean it up for the next major version. So the blog post also outlined a number of fine-grained controls. So for example, you can make it so individual plugins get automatically updated, or say like only update this one. You can also say update across major versions. Which a few 100,000 people already turned on. They already turned on like major release. They're like, yeah, that's fine. My site runs on that as well because I like getting the emails. I think it's actually really cool. Hey, I just pushed the button to release WordPress to everyone, and then my site immediately emailed me about it. That's kind of cool. The API in this case also, if for some reason there is nothing and the update doesn't go through or whatever it is, we can just say, by the way, like when you're done, email the administrator to let them know that you weren't able to do the update. We didn't even try. Maybe they have it disabled. But we can tell them, hey, WordPress 4.0 is available. Update now. Send that to them through email. So some results. I mentioned this 90% number earlier. Well, on day 0 for WordPress 3.9.1, we did 2.7 million updates in about 6 hours. This was not all the sites that updated, just in the first 6 hours. The real-world chance of one of these critical failures was 0.004%. That's 4 nines, for the record. With a 6 at the end. And we're going to make that 5 nines and eventually 0. If you do the math on this, if you saw the other number, 99 problems. 2.7 million updates, 99 sites have this critical failure. That's it. And here's the best thing. We don't think any of the sites actually broke. Because all that happened for 60 of them is that the README didn't copy over. Oh no. And the remaining 39, I guess, we checked them all. We looked at them. They were all fine. They were all up. They didn't break. Maybe they didn't get all the files, or maybe we just weren't able to verify it. But so this idea of like the fear of my site will break, it is a very real fear. It's entirely possible that the PHP process craps out, someone unplugs the server. Hey, it can happen, right? I want unplug the server to be the only error code that I can't catch for, honestly. So we made a promise to everyone. If you're one of the 99 lucky people, which I'm assuming you're not, you got an email that said this: the WordPress team is willing to help you. You could forward this email directly to us, and the lead developers of the project will take care of you. We will fix your site. Now, there's 2 main reasons for this. Well, a few main reasons for this. First off, we lost their trust, and that sucks. We want to gain it back immediately. So the email that they're installed tells them, says like, email this address, we'll help you one-on-one. That's really important. 2, we want to make sure that their site never experiences this problem ever again. We'll make sure whatever was going haywire, we'll fix. 3, we have all this great data. But unfortunately, with only 99 failures, we don't know exactly what's going on anymore with these 99 sites. Because we accounted for all the obvious cases. So now that we have access to these sites, in some cases getting FTP credentials or SSH keys dropped on these boxes, we can now figure out exactly what's going on and reduce this 99 to 0. I estimate if we get like 10 of these 99 people to reach out to us, and a few of them already have, we'll be able to drop this down to not 5 nines, but rather 0% chance of critical failure because we're able to account for all those things. So in the end, we had originally this button people would have to press to update to a security release. Well, only 2% of the updates that occurred happened as a result of button press. 98% of all WordPress security releases now, automatic updates to that site. And by default, within 12 hours. So some of our next steps are that, first off, we can now, if you think about security in WordPress, you laugh. And if you also think about security in WordPress from a from a more reasoned modern standpoint, you realize that the vast majority of issues are either server configuration or plugins, and normally really, really bad plugins. Well, we can now push out an update for an insecure or malicious plugin or a spammy plugin across every site using it. So that's kind of cool. We don't need to wait 12 hours. We can push it out in minutes. This came up very recently. If you guys saw the Drupal vulnerability a few weeks ago, they ended up doing a PSA after that said like any site that has been not updated for the last, I believe, in the first 7 hours should be assumed to be compromised. I think that was maybe slightly naive. It's probably like any site at all should assume to be compromised. But nonetheless, there were immediately conversations in the Joomla community, this is very random now, talking about like, well, but would WordPress even be able to have solved this because it's 12 hours? And I dropped in on the comment, I said, actually, we added a flag to the API that allowed us to narrow the window when we wanted to. So if there's a release coming, we can just narrow that window and say, hey, check back a little more often, and we can narrow this down to an hour or even less than that if we wanted to. And so now we can update 2.7 million or 10.7 million sites in the span of an hour. In part because we know that the WordPress.org servers can take it. Maybe the shared hosts might have a little more trouble with that. We can also start to experiment with major release updates. I think we will at some point, and certainly this idea of like striving for it, in that maybe we only update after we release that first patch release, fixing all of our regressions. And then we're like, okay, now we can do this. Or maybe we start with an opt-in checkbox. I think eventually that WordPress should just do this period, because that's kind of our goal. But we have a few other tricks and techniques that we can do as well, is that we can also figure out like how can we bring all these ancient WordPress versions to the latest? And how can we bring auto updates to more sites? So if we have this thought of like, how can we bring latest WordPress versions to the latest? Well, right now, any version 3.7 or higher can use auto updates. Maybe 2 years from now, we're doing major release updates, but that 3.7 site is stuck on like 3.7.15 because we keep giving them security releases because we're nice. And because we want to, because that's what makes sense. Rather than just dropping support and saying we're no longer going to backport our stuff all the way back to 3.7, which might be like 15 different branches by that point, we can instead ship another release that bumps 3.7 up to like 4.5 or 4.9 or whatever release it is. And we can do that because at that point we will have figured out how to do major release updates without breaking anything. And with that instructions file being used in 3.7, we'll be able to very easily just say like, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine. Your site's just coming along for the ride. And people say like, you can't do that with the WordPress site. If you install WordPress 1.0 right now, install like 5 or 6 plugins on it, and then hit from that time and hit update, it'll work. It'll go through all the schema changes, it'll get to the very latest version. If the plugin was written fine during 1.0 or 1.5, it'll work all the way up to 4.0, which is the current version, which spans, I don't know, 30-something major releases. That's how good our backwards compatibility is. So can we bring auto updates to more sites? Well, yeah, because what we're doing now is we're identifying which hosts have all the lagging versions. So now I can go to a Go host that doesn't exist. I'll use Go host as an example. And I can hand them this pile of URLs and like, hey, we think all of these sites are on your host, and we think they're all running an old version. What can we do about it? Can we work up a plan of action? Many of these hosts are already updating all their one-click installs. They just don't know about these. And they're not worried about breaking WordPress in this case. They're really worried about breaking like other things. So it's not just lagging versions of WordPress that we're working on, but what about lagging versions of PHP? You hear these statistics like, oh my God, WordPress still uses PHP 5.2. Yep, because it's like 6 million of our sites. That's a lot. So until we get to the point where that's like way less than 6 million, we're not really going to adjust our minor versions. But we do have a lot of relationships with hosts that we can do this. So now what we're doing is we're pushing every shared host, as was just announced like 2 weeks ago. We're using our relationships with every host to push them to PHP 5.5 or higher by default. And getting rid of all of their old versions as well. This same thing is going to happen with WordPress versions, which is of course our focus, and with MySQL versions. But the moment we bump our minimum requirement, we abandon a ton of these sites. So we're not doing that approach. Now you might think this is similar to Go PHP 5. It actually isn't. Go PHP 5 was about bumping the minimum versions, forcing users to get in the middle, and saying like, hey, you need to fix this. You need to go ahead, like I need to run the latest version of PHP. I don't know what this is, but can you help me? We don't want to involve users in this at all. So we're going completely around them. We're going directly to the host. We're working with them. We have a lot of influence hosts now. We're working with them to figure this all out. We've also looked at some data around Go PHP 5 because we have our own usage data from shared hosts. It didn't cause any kind of real drop in PHP 4. In case you're curious, the numbers ended up slowly declining for the next 3 years until Drupal, Joomla, and WordPress all bumped its minimum requirements of 5.2 at the exact same time anyway. So we're trying this a little differently now. The number of sites that are running under 5.5 is somewhere like 95%. Seriously, 95%. So we're going to see in the next year where that number will be. I have a feeling it'll be doing a hell of a lot better. So our goal is this idea of like seamless automatic updates of everything. WordPress, plugins, themes, translations, all of it. This is the goal. Can we do it? I don't know. Are we crazy? Absolutely. We are. This is entirely crazy. We're insane. But this is what we want to do. This is where we want to go. And we're doing this because we care a lot about our users and because we have a lot of knowledge and experience, specifically in this one area of not only user experience, but also in updates. And we know also in a few years when we start trying out major release updates that they are going to trust us because we've been doing this piecemeal the whole way since 2008 now. So some lessons. First is that communicate early and often. Try to document all decisions that are going out there. This is really important. You want to listen to feedback and do try and address as many concerns as you can, or at least acknowledge them. A lot of these are legitimate concerns. We did not solve everyone's legitimate concerns, and we know that. In many cases, the answer is it's not for you. But that doesn't mean be defensive. Also, of course, extensive testing and QA is going to be really important for something like this. But for us, the big one is that actually having data to analyze is the key. Analyzing the data is there too, but having data to begin with is really, really important. Don't burden your users with the decision that you should have made. Make the decision if that's what makes sense. You should really be focusing on that a lot. And finally, rather than simplifying it down to a single click, in general, not just with updates, not just what you're doing, but strive for simplicity and try and do what is best for your users. Thank you very much.
All right, we have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has one. Oop, saw in the back first. Sorry, Larry.
Do you want to answer yours now? I'll shout it out while he's running the mic back. Okay.
Hey, hi. You talked about when it's under version control like Git or anything that you don't do any kind of update, but how do you suggest that we go? Because like going through, let's say, 100 of websites and updating them manually, it can be a bit tedious. You have some kind of tool or
This was actually really interesting because a lot of people were like, no, I want my version control site to be updated. I was like, really? And they said, yeah, because then I'll go back through and I'll just do the git pull later and I'll check it in or whatever it is I'm doing. You can flip the toggle if you wanted to. It's so fine-grained that if you wanted to say, ignore the fact that this is a version-controlled checkout, go ahead and do it. That said, it can be tedious to update a bunch of sites. Some things I would recommend. First off, there's this really great tool called WP CLI. Yes, there's a command line client for WordPress. It's been around for years. It's awesome. I use it as much as I use the dashboard for WordPress when I'm doing administration. There's a lot of tools there based on doing a lot of remote management. There's also a lot of tools in the WordPress space for remote management of sites as well. Whether it's like, there are like managed WP and a number of different things out there that if you want to do that, you could. That said, a lot of people do have, especially if they're running a lot of sites, they have certain deployment processes in place that they're able to do this. If you want to do it this way, you can. You can use the auto update system if you want.
All right, here you go, Larry.
So this being PHP World, I'll ask, the code that's powering this auto update system, is that tied to WordPress's architecture, or is that
Very much
something
so.
that could be
Everything
released?
in WordPress is tied to WordPress's architecture. Yes. There's really nothing too fancy there, though. I mean, most of it's done in like one function. I know it's funny. More than that. But I mean, there's nothing really fancy about this. It's downloading it, it's verifying it, it's moving it along the right pieces. We do a lot of things that are very special to us because we're dealing with talking with an API. There's nothing in there that is like secret sauce or anything of that nature. Would you need to rewrite it to work there? Yes. Is it something that makes sense as a standalone library? Actually, probably not, because of the amount of stuff that it relies specifically on WordPress to do. Not just WordPress APIs, but just generally it's assuming that it's dealing with a WordPress site in the way it's certain files that it needs to know about and things of that nature, where the amount of config it would be required for it to be standalone would just be kind of comical. Yeah, if you guys want to use it or play with it or take a look at it, it'd be fun. But you guys would probably be better off just writing something yourself and just following the same outline for the approach that we took. But that would be about it.
Okay. And second question, as long as I still have the microphone. For updating plugins, obviously if you've got some third-party plugin, it's out, people are using it, the developer working on it adds some new functionality or does some other change, and then a security release is found. Doesn't that mean that if you then do the security release on that, there's all the other updates that come along with it, which may or may not be trivially safe to do?
Yes, so we did think about this. We thought about it, the initial perspective is, well, maybe we only update it if they're already running the latest version. If they've already shown that they want to keep this updated, we'll update it for them to include the patch. And then we thought about, well, what we can also do is we can also have them generate individual branch builds and then update the plugin across outside of these major features and being able to give individual patches to all these sites. And then we also realized that if it's important for us for one of the lead developers to configure and properly ship out an auto update, because we're going to want to audit this ourselves and go through it that way, then chances are that feature is less important than the site. Is less important than keeping the site secure. Because a lot of these are like, oh, by the way, it was running like an insecure PHP min inside this plugin, and you're like, oh my god, and like forcing that, no matter the feature, it makes a little more sense. We do play it on very much a case-by-case basis, though, for exactly how we do this. If the plugin is using semantic versioning, you might have a little bit of a shot at it. But a lot of times people are just updating plugins anyway, so it's really on the onus on the plugin author to make sure that they're not just randomly adding stuff and trying to do it the right way. It's definitely an unsolved problem. It's just we play it by case basis to how we want to do. We did one where we actually did 10 different versions of this plugin and pushed them for 10 different branches because that's how bad the vulnerability was.
So plugin auto updates are opt-in plugin.
Yeah, they're opt-in at the code level. They're essentially, a better way to say it, they're experimental. You can turn it on if you want. People have in a lot of cases. A lot of people who are developers who are like running their random friend's blog are just turning it on because they're like, I don't need to deal with it now. It's on my server and I don't need to deal with it. So,
you mentioned a few of the same things that the composer community is talking about: semantic versioning, making sure everyone is able to upgrade. Do you see any place for Composer and WordPress to integrate either one way or the other?
Potentially, I don't know. One of the biggest problems with something like Composer is that when you're dealing with dependencies, if the dependencies don't match, Composer yells at the developer. Well, we don't really have that luxury because we don't have a developer to yell at. So we have to somehow solve this problem just for the user as transparently as possible. Dependencies is a whole other issue. In our case, in terms of like at least semantic versioning, we expect that eventually like our version number will just be really hard to find. Like you're running the latest version of WordPress. What version of Chrome are you on? What is it, like 39, 40, 41? Firefox, you don't know. Facebook, what version of Facebook you're running? You're running yesterday's. So that's kind of our long-term goal. It doesn't make sense for everyone. It doesn't make sense if you're doing like crazy deployments and whatnot, but it's definitely an issue. And we're looking at ways of plugins depending on other plugins. And it's more of a user experience problem than it is a code problem.
Here, we have time for one more question. Oh, I see a hand in the back. You're gonna make me run.
Is it a good question?
So you mentioned you're essentially, you consider yourself more or less backward compatible back to WordPress 1. Can you imagine a situation where you would need to break compatibility?
Sure, but we kind of do it all the time, just kind of quietly. I was explaining this the other day, last night to some people, is that we say like, yes, we are very strong on backwards compatibility, and it makes a lot of sense for us. If you heard my talk yesterday, I mentioned that, or if you didn't hear my talk yesterday, I mentioned that backwards compatibility for us is really, really important because it is why we've gotten the install base we have, not in spite of all of that baggage. We deliberately carry around a decent amount of technical debt because we don't want to force that onto the user. At the same time, if you look at it from the case of, let's say, Drupal from 7 to 8, that's going to take about 4 years. Okay, they're 3 years in, they have probably another year left, and they're rewriting the entire code base. If you look at WordPress from now to WordPress 2.9, that's 13 major releases ago. It's 4 years, and you look at that window of how much has changed in that time, that's a pretty significant shift as well. Most of the code is different. So we are rewriting, we just do it a little more incrementally. And for this, going into just in terms of backwards compatibility, yeah, we break things, like features get removed and things like that. Our biggest concern, though, is that are we going to break anything? Is a plugin today doing something right that tomorrow is suddenly not right? And that's when we want to make sure that we're doing this in a very graceful fashion. We don't want it to just blow up. Excuse me, we don't want it to just blow up. We don't want the user's just gonna blame us and then they're gone. Like they don't care anymore about this. They just want it all to just work. So for this, dealing with this kind of backward compatibility, yeah, the feature gets removed or something gets upgraded or something changes. We want to avoid syntax errors, fatal errors, really crazy changes. And maybe 3 or 4 releases down the line, we're like, oh, by the way, this file should totally be removed because we're not using it anymore. So it's a very different approach. I wouldn't recommend it if you don't like if you really don't like technical debt. I would recommend it if you want more users. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
I'll be around if you guys want to talk WordPress or anything else like that. When I heard very briefly about at the Automatic table, I don't work at Automatic, but they're awesome people. A lot of the assumptions that I addressed in my talk yesterday keep coming up at that table. So if you want to talk, I'm around tonight, except for me going to a college really quick to talk, and then I'll be back. So yeah, I'm happy to engage and talk WordPress. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.